If you spent any time in the Linux community, you probably read or heard about how this desktop uses less resources, or saw people looking at the least demanding thing they could run on their computer, and there is a joy in trying to squeeze out the last 2 megabytes of RAM consumption that you can deduce from what your system uses. But do desktop environments really differ that much in terms of how much resources they use? That's what I tried looking at. I started with the assumption that GNOME and KDE were on par and probably the least efficient ones, and that everything else used less resources and thus less battery life. But I ran a few tests and my results don't quite match that preconceived notion. So let's see how graphical desktop environments compare to each other in that regard, and then afterwards we'll take a look at the Slimbook laptop I used to run these tests, the Slimbook Evo, because it is pretty nice. But of course all of this will happen after this message from our sponsor. So this video is sponsored by Kasm. It's a project for running Linux workspaces in your web browser. The Kasm team has released an open source Android emulator now, based on the Redroid project, and it provides an Android mobile handset and developer environment in a custom Linux desktop that, again, you can stream straight from a web browser. This workspace provides access to the full ecosystem of Android mobile applications, including custom APKs, right from that web browser. You can run the Kasm open source Android emulator image directly in Docker, or Kasm Workspaces Community Edition provides an orchestration engine for self-hosting. Now, to learn more about Kasm Workspaces and their Android platform workspace, click the link in the description below. Okay, so let's begin with a few pointers on the tests I ran and how I ran them. So I needed the same distro base for all of these tests to make sure that only the desktop environment changed anything, or at least that the base was very similar. And after a quick look, I decided that Fedora was that right base because it has a lot of spins for most of the graphical desktops you can find. It also tends to avoid changing too many things from the very default experience, which is what I want to test, the vanilla version of a desktop. I used Fedora 42's beta because it releases in less than a month, it is already very stable, and it has the latest versions of these desktops, so it's a bit more future-proof. And I know certain distros will take a specific desktop and optimize it entirely, and some distros might have a faster base than Fedora, but I don't care about this. All I want to do is compare the vanilla experience for each desktop. So if Super Rockstar OS has 3% better performance on KDE, it doesn't really matter to all of this comparison. So what I'll be measuring is the total RAM used after a cold boot onto the desktop using Top, because it's the same application on all desktops and it's terminal based for minimal resource usage. The battery life usage was also measured by running the exact same video in a loop inside of Firefox for 1 hour and then extrapolating the results. And I know I didn't run the battery all the way for it to be completely emptied, but there were 7 desktops to try, so I had to install the distro, run all the tests, and honestly, charging the battery all the way up and discharging it for 6 to 8 hours every time, I just do not have that kind of spare time to make those videos. So 1 hour extrapolated for the entire battery runtime, I think it gives you a good enough impression. I also measured CPU and graphics performance on those desktops by running both Geekbench 6 and the Unigine Heaven benchmark on all of these desktops. They ran as independent applications, so I just copy-pasted the exact same folder containing the entire app and its libraries from a USB key to the installed distro with the desktop and ran it there. The exact same settings all the time in case of Heaven, so 1080p, full screen with all other settings at medium, and anti-aliasing to the max. I also used the default session recommended for each desktop, so Wayland for the desktops that default to Wayland, X11 for those that recommend using X11. Now, I realize it's not a 100% apples to apples comparison because obviously some desktops on X.org and some are on Wayland, but forcing a desktop that deprecated X.org to run on that wasn't a good idea, and forcing a desktop made for x.org to run on a half-baked Wayland session would also not have been fair, so we'll have to settle for that kind of comparison right now. And all those tests are done on a Slimbook Evo 14 laptop. It's an ultrabook, I will review it at the end of the video. Now, Slimbook did not sponsor that video, it's just a review unit that I do have to send back at the end. I didn't get any money for this. So let's begin with RAM usage. I measured this using top after the second cold boot, because after the first, the system had some updating to do in some cases, ran some potential indexing stuff, so I waited for all of that to settle down, and then I rebooted and measured for a length of time the amount of megabytes that this desktop consumed. And yes, it's megabytes, not megabytes, because top reports megabytes. It's basically the same, except megabytes are multiples of thousands and megabytes are multiples of 1024. So GNOME used 2100 megabytes. This is all out of the 16 gigs of RAM, or 1560 megabytes of RAM that is on the device I tested things on. And yes, that total amount matters because some distributions preempt some RAM. They preload stuff into the RAM, and so numbers reported are a bit higher than what you might see the higher amount of RAM that you have. Not all distros do it, not all desktops do it either, so your numbers might differ from mine even if you test it with a different distro but the exact same vanilla desktop. So after the first boot, GNOME used around 3100 megabytes, but after each subsequent reboot, it was closer to 2000 to 2100, and that's with 451 tasks running in total. KDE used between 3400 and 3500 megabytes after the first boot, but after each subsequent boot, it was around 2670 to 2750, with 439 tasks running in the background. That is higher than GNOME in Fedora, and that's comparing KDE 6.3.2 stable to GNOME 48 beta. As we'll see in the following comparison, KDE is the one that used the most RAM on that system. So either it preloads more stuff or it's just more hungry than other desktops. It is, in Fedora 42, on that device, the desktop that just ate up the most RAM. Cinnamon used 1890 to 1950 megabytes of RAM with 433 tasks running, and that was on x.org because this is the default session Cinnamon uses. GNOME and KDE were both using Wayland. Budgie, also running on x.org, used around 1450 megabytes of RAM after a cold boot. It's one of the desktops that uses the least amount of resources of that entire comparison, and that's with 437 tasks running. Cosmic has a Fedora spin, and even though that desktop is still in alpha, it used a little less than 2000 megabytes of RAM around 1970, with 414 tasks running. LXQt used a bit under 1400 megabytes, 1370 to 1390, with 409 tasks. It's one of the least resource intensive when it comes to RAM usage. And XFC takes the cake here with numbers just a bit lower than LXQt, at least on Fedora 42, 1360 to 1380 megabytes with 412 tasks running. So in terms of RAM, you have the two big names, GNOME and KDE, over 2000 megabytes of RAM being used, so 2 gigs basically, and more. KDE seems the most hungry desktop, at least on its Fedora 42 spin. And then you have all the other ones under 2 gigs, with XFC seemingly being the least resource intensive and LXQt being very low, and Cosmic for now is under 2 gigs as well. Although it's an alpha, and the more features they add and the more subsystems they add, the more RAM it will tend to use, so I wouldn't be surprised if it caught up to GNOME or to KDE. Now you will also notice that Mate is not in this comparison, and that's because no matter what I tried, the ISO for Fedora 42 beta with Mate could not boot on the system I tried to. Well, it booted, but I never reached a graphical desktop on that Slimbook Evo. I tried Ventoy, I tried flashing the ISO with multiple different flashing tools, I tried different USB drives. Over the 3 or 4 days it took for me to record all of this, it just never started. So Mate is not part of this benchmark, unfortunately. The next is CPU performance. I used Geekbench 6 with the exact same version of that program, copied from a USB drive straight to the hard drive, and I ran it in the terminal emulator that each desktop shipped by default. And this is on an AMD Ryzen 7 8845HS CPU, by the way. The scores were run 3 times for each desktop to smooth out potential hiccups, and they're all pretty close. In single core, Cosmic got a slightly better score than the others, averaging 2706 compared to the least performant, which is GNOME, at 2607. The rest were all around 2650 to 2700, no big difference, but between Cosmic and GNOME it was a 3% difference, and that's the biggest it got. So the desktop you're running really does not affect single-core CPU performance at all, at least not when it's idle. In multi-core, the best performer was Budgie with 11,499. The worst one was, again, GNOME at 11,200, but that difference is 2.6%, so that's also not really significant. GNOME might use a teeny tiny bit more of your CPU, but it really doesn't matter. Unlike RAM consumption, when your desktop is at idle, it just doesn't use the CPU. So it really doesn't matter if you need the full fat performance of your CPU, the application that takes priority and runs right in front of you, like for example, a game or a big pro application, it will use the CPU normally and the desktop just doesn't really have an impact. Now for graphics performance, I ran Unigine Heaven at 1080p, full screen, medium settings, and obviously 3D settings and multi-monitor disabled. Here again, the desktop you run seems to have zero bearing on real performance. The X.org desktops seem to perform a little bit worse with that benchmark, but it's really insignificant. The best performer was Cosmic with a benchmark score of 854. The worst one was LXQt with 834, but they all reached maximums of around 60 to 61 FPS, an average of 33 all around, and a minimum of around 13 FPS in that benchmark. Again, here the desktop you pick really does not matter in terms of the performance you're gonna get. The application that is full screen and focused will take priority, will get all the GPU with the same drivers and the same distro base. The desktop has no bearing on the performance. So if you want gaming, don't focus on the desktop you're running, focus on the tools around it and the distro base. Now, where there are differences though is in battery life. Here there is a clear gulf between some X11 desktops and the Wayland ones. Running the same video in a loop inside of Firefox installed as an RPM package, GNOME lost 12% of battery in an hour. Extrapolated, that's 8 hours and 20 minutes of battery life. KDE performed the exact same, 12% lost in an hour, so 8 hours and 20 minutes of battery life. Cinnamon lost 18% of battery over the same hour, which equates to 5 hours and 30 minutes. Definitely a lot less battery life, and that's on an X.org session. Budgie, also on X.org, lost the same 18%, 17.90 something in an hour, so rounding up, it's the same 5 hours and 30 minutes. Cosmic performed on par with GNOME and KDE with 12% lost in an hour, about 8 hours and 20 minutes of battery life, and LXQt was the outlier. It uses X.org in its session, but it only lost 12% of battery for an hour, meaning it's on par with the Wayland desktops, GNOME, KDE, and Cosmic. And XFC was the same, also reaching around 8 hours and 20 minutes, despite being an X.org desktop. So there is something there, and it's not really X.org versus Wayland, because we do have two X.org sessions having the exact same numbers as GNOME and KDE and Cosmic on Wayland. And it's not GTK versus Qt because, well, we do have some really good performers using GTK and some good performers using Qt. So I don't exactly know why these perform that much worse. Maybe they do have a subsystem that runs more often. Maybe the CPU isn't turned off as often. I'm not sure. What is sure is that I ran those tests 3 times for these desktops and it always came back the same. They use more battery, at least on Fedora 42 Beta on this specific computer. So to conclude on that performance, it looks like the only areas where your desktop really matters is in RAM usage and in battery life. For RAM usage, if you have something like 16 gigs, I would say you don't need to worry about the desktop you chose, it's just all going to be insignificant. At 8 gigs, you probably don't care either unless you plan on running some really intensive apps. If you have 4 gigs or less, then that's where you absolutely need a lower impact desktop environment because you don't want to start with something that will use half of that at idle. No desktop will drain recent CPUs and GPUs more than another, they just give you the exact same performance whether that's Wayland or X11. As per battery life, that RAM consumption doesn't translate to more draw for energy. It actually seems to not matter, but there are 2 desktops that didn't perform the same, that's Budgie and Cinnamon. Don't really know why, it might be a quirk in Fedora 42 Beta, it might be a quirk of the drivers for the exact device I've been running. I made sure to update the BIOS and everything to make sure that everything was top-notch, but yeah, I did notice this significant difference. If you run anything on a desktop computer, your desktop doesn't matter. It just doesn't have any bearing on performance, and the increased RAM usage, if you have enough RAM, it also really doesn't matter at all. As everyone says, unused RAM is wasted RAM up to a point at least. If you're running on a laptop though, maybe check on the distro that you're using that some desktops don't perform better or at least don't give you more battery life than others, because it looks like, at least in my tests, that Cinnamon and Budgie perform way worse than the rest, but might be a quirk, so you're gonna have to test things out on your own, just something to look out for. Okay, so now it's time to talk about the laptop itself, the device I ran all these tests on. So this is the 14-inch Slimbook Evo laptop. It's your usual ultrabook, like the thin wedge design that everyone knows and you've seen since, I think, the first MacBook Airs basically. It is an all-aluminum design, apart from the bezels around the screen, which are made out of plastic. The rest is pure aluminum. Now this is the 14-inch, they also have a 15-inch if you prefer, it's the exact same internals, but it's not the exact same body. This laptop, the 14-inch at least, is lightweight, it's 1.4 kilos or 3.09 pounds, and it's compact at 31 centimeters in length, 22 centimeters in width, and 1.69 centimeters in height. It has a 14-inch display in a 16:10 aspect ratio and a 3K resolution up to 2880 by 1800, which is a display size to resolution ratio that is just bad. It requires you to use fractional scaling. At 2x, things are too big. At 1x, things are way too small. So you want that 150 to 175%, which is not the best. Most Linux desktops handle fractional scaling well these days, at least the recent ones, but it still results in more battery usage and more draw. And before you coming for the battery usage statistics, I ran everything at the native resolution without fractional scaling. Now that display goes up to 120 Hz and it supports 100% of sRGB. It's also decently bright at 400 nits. That laptop only comes with one choice of CPU, the Ryzen 7 8845HS. You've seen it in action throughout the entire video. It performs really well. It has a Radeon 780M integrated GPU and an NPU for people who care about the AI stuff. Now, in terms of design, there is nothing wrong with this laptop. It's sturdy, it looks elegant, it looks simple. Now, Slimbook does have some stickers on the chassis, and their branding is also, in my opinion, pretty big, but you can ask them to laser etch something else or to just not do any branding at all. The only thing I don't really like here is the noticeable give in the middle of the laptop around the spacebar and the G and H keys. It flexes a bit more than I'd like. The rest is very sturdy and confidence-inspiring. As per the ports, the laptop comes with no barrel charger, it's USB-C charging only, so that's gonna please a lot of people. And you get on the right an SD card reader and two USB-A 3.2 Gen 1 ports. On the left, you have a USB-A 2.0 port, a USB-C 3.2 Gen 2 port, and an audio jack. And on the back, you have an HDMI 2.1, a USB-C 4, and a gigabit Ethernet port as well. You also have a physical webcam switch to hide the potato quality webcam if you don't want to use it, and through the BIOS you can disable the mic and audio as a whole, the webcam, Bluetooth or Wi-Fi. The mic is, as usual, pretty trash. It's gonna pick up on the fan noise and it's gonna pick up on every key press, and as always it's just cranked up to the max on every distro, meaning it's gonna peak and saturate like crazy until you lower that mic volume. The speakers are decent, but they do vibrate the chassis and they're not exceptional. They're okay. You also get an 80 watt-hour battery in there, which they rate at 9 to 10 hours of autonomy in energy saver mode, playing 1080p video at 50% brightness. What we found is more around 8.5 hours instead of 9 to 10, but yeah, that's close enough. The keyboard is fine. It's not the best I've used on the laptop, but it's also not bad. It has relatively slim key travel, but it's not a problem. It's not super rigid, like it's not one of those ultra flat MacBook keyboards where you felt like you were typing on glass. You still have a comfortable distance and a comfortable cushion at the end of the press. The touchpad though is nice, it's glass, it's very smooth, it's very precise. It is a dive board mechanism, but you don't need to use too much force to actually press it, even above the middle part. You can get that laptop with up to 96 gigs of RAM. It is user upgradable, by the way, and up to 2 times 4 terabytes NVMe SSDs. That laptop starts at $1099 for the entry-level model, which isn't super expensive for 16 gigs of RAM and 500 gigs of SSD, and that already includes the value-added tax as well. As a whole, it is a very solid laptop. As you've seen in the performance numbers, it's no slouch. It's gonna be able to play some relatively weaker games that are not AAA and super demanding. It has a very good CPU, it has solid battery life. There are a few build things that I'm not a fan of, a bit too much give in the middle of the keyboard, and also that sort of plasticky noise in the touchpad, but it's not confidence breaking, it doesn't feel cheap in the slightest. You've got a good port selection as well. I think it's a really good laptop if you need a Linux device. That's a good one. Anyway, this will conclude this video. Let me know what you thought as always in the comments. Click all the YouTube buttons so the channel can keep growing. And as always, thank you all for watching. Thank you all for your support. And I guess you'll see me in the next one, I guess in a few days. Bye!